I was born into a galaxy where humans were considered the weakest species in the known universe. Our weapons were primitive, our ships barely held together, and our lifespans were laughably short compared to the ancient races that dominated space. The Vorthak Empire had ruled for 10,000 years with their energy manipulation abilities. The crystalline Zephyrians could phase through matter itself. The mechanical nexus collective processed information faster than organic minds could even comprehend. And then there were humans, soft, fragile, emotional creatures who had somehow stumbled into the cosmic arena with nothing but crude kinetic weapons and an inexplicable refusal to stay down when beaten. I am Commander HFY of the Galactic Defense Corps, a Vorthak warrior who spent 3 centuries believing that humans were the cosmic equivalent of children playing with toys they didn't understand. I commanded fleets, conquered systems, and watched lesser species bow before the might of the Empire. But everything I thought I knew about power, about strength, about what it truly means to be a warrior, changed on the day the Devourers arrived at the edge of our galaxy. An ancient evil that had consumed entire galactic clusters was coming for us, and our mighty weapons, our advanced technology, our superior abilities meant nothing against an enemy that fed on energy itself. That was the day I found myself fighting alongside humans for the first time. That was the day I discovered that real power isn't about the weapons you carry or the abilities you're born with. It's about something far more dangerous and beautiful than any of us could have imagined. This is the story of how the weakest species in the galaxy taught the strongest what it really means to fight for something worth dying for. The first time Commander HFY encountered humans, they were losing a battle spectacularly. Their small fleet of 12 ships hung in space like wounded animals, spitting defiance at a pirate consortium force 3 times their size. Energy beams lanced through the void, most missing their targets entirely, while return fire from the pirates systematically carved through human armor plating like it was made of compressed sand. HFY watched from the bridge of his dreadnought, the eternal dominance, with the detached interest of someone observing an educational documentary about inferior species. His scaled hands drummed against the command throne as tactical displays showed the humans' inevitable destruction unfolding in real time. The battle would be over in minutes, and then the pirates would scatter before his arrival, leaving behind the debris of another failed human expedition. "Sir, the human vessels are transmitting on all frequencies," reported his communications officer, a young Vorthak named Kelthio. "They appear to be requesting assistance from us." HFY's voice carried the rumbling bass tones typical of his species, each word measured and precise. How delightfully naive. What makes them think we would intervene in their pathetic struggle? The bridge crew exchanged glances. It was well known throughout the Galactic Defense Corps that Commander HFY harbored particular disdain for humans. In his 300 years of service, he had watched them stumble through space like drunken younglings, starting conflicts they couldn't finish and making alliances they couldn't honor. They were loud, emotional, and worst of all, unpredictable in ways that defied military doctrine. "Sir," Kelthio continued hesitantly, "there are civilian transports in their formation. Long-range scans indicate approximately 15,000 humans aboard those vessels." HFY's amber eyes narrowed as he studied the tactical display more carefully. Indeed, 3 of the human ships were clearly non-military vessels, their hulls bulging with the telltale signs of extended life support systems and cramped living quarters. Colony ships, most likely filled with families seeking new worlds to populate. The sight should have stirred some measure of sympathy in a civilized being. Instead, it only reinforced his opinion of human tactical incompetence. What manner of species brings their offspring into contested space? He muttered. Do they have no concept of strategic planning? No understanding of threat assessment? His tactical officer, a stern-faced Vorthack veteran named HFY cleared his throat respectfully. Commander, regulations state that we are obligated to assist civilian vessels under attack by hostile forces. Regulations written by committee. HFY replied dismissively. Bureaucratic nonsense designed to make politicians feel noble. We have more important matters to attend to. But even as he spoke, something about the human formation nagged at him. The military vessels, those 9 ships that should have broken ranks and fled by now, had instead formed a protective sphere around the civilian transports. They were taking devastating damage, losing atmosphere and crew with each passing moment, yet not a single ship moved from their defensive positions. Fascinating, he murmured, leaning forward in his command throne. Look at their formation, SYTH. What do you see? The tactical officer studied the displays, his expression shifting from professional attention to puzzled interest. They're maintaining defensive positions despite catastrophic losses, sir. It appears they intend to sacrifice themselves rather than abandon the civilian vessels. Precisely. But observe their targeting patterns. HFY gestured to the weapons fire analysis streaming across his screens. They're not trying to destroy the pirates. They're trying to disable them, force them to break off the attack. This was curious behavior indeed. Any rational military commander facing overwhelming odds would either retreat or attempt to inflict maximum damage on the enemy. These humans are doing neither. They were fighting a holding action with no hope of victory, buying time for something that would never come. Or so HFY thought until the largest of the human vessels, a heavy cruiser designated UES Defiance, suddenly broke formation and accelerated directly toward the pirate flagship. Emergency klaxons wailed from the human ship's hull as atmosphere vented from dozens of breaches, but still it pressed forward. What are they doing? Kelfio asked, his voice tight with disbelief. HFY's tactical systems provided the answer moments later. The human ship's power core was overloading deliberately. They were turning their vessel into a weapon, a massive kinetic bomb aimed at the heart of the pirate formation. It was suicide, pure and simple, but it would also create an opening for the other ships to escape. By the ancient stones, SYTH breathed. They're going to ram the flagship. The pirate commander apparently reached the same conclusion, because the enemy formation suddenly scattered like startled scavengers. But the Defiance adjusted course, following the flagship with grim determination. The human ship was coming apart around its crew, sections of hull peeling away like shed scales, yet somehow it maintained pursuit. HFY found himself gripping the armrests of his command throne, his usual detachment replaced by something uncomfortably close to respect. Signal the fleet, he said quietly. All ships, prepare for combat intervention. Sir, SYEH turned to stare at his commander in surprise. You heard me, tactical. The humans have committed to a course of action. Let's see if they have the resolve to see it through. HFY's fingers danced across his command interface, bringing the massive Dreadnought's weapons systems online. Target the pirate vessels. Fire when ready. The Eternal Dominance erupted in controlled fury, its energy cannons reaching across space to tear into the scattered pirate formation. Other Vorthack ships followed suit, their combined firepower turning the tide of battle in seconds. Pirate vessels exploded or fled, their crews abandoning the fight rather than face the might of the Galactic Defense Corps. The human cruiser, its ramming run suddenly, unnecessary, tried to abort its suicidal course. But too much damage had been done, too many systems compromised. The ship continued its death spiral toward the now fleeing pirate flagship, its crew trapped aboard a weapon they could no longer control. "Tractor beam," HFY ordered. "Lock onto that cruiser and pull them clear." "Sir, the power fluctuations from their overloading core might damage our systems," HFY Mole warned. "Do it anyway." The massive beam of gravitational energy reached out from the dreadnought, wrapping around the dying human vessel like a gentle giant's hand. Slowly, carefully, it pulled the Defiance away from its collision course, holding it steady while emergency systems fought to stabilize the overloading reactor. Minutes passed in tense silence before the human ship's core finally cycled down to safe levels. The immediate crisis was over, but the vessel was clearly beyond saving. Its hull had been breached in too many places, its internal structure compromised beyond repair. "Commander," Kelfio reported, "we're receiving a transmission from the human vessel. Audio only. Put it through." A human voice filled the bridge, speaking in the crude but functional galactic standard that their species had adopted. The words were thick with emotion, exhaustion, and something else that HFY couldn't immediately identify. "Vort Hack vessel, this is Captain Sarah Chun of the U.S. Defiance. On behalf of my crew and the 15,000 civilians you just saved, I want to thank you. We know our species doesn't have the best reputation in this sector, and we know you had no obligation to help us. But you did anyway, and that means everything to our people." There was a pause, the sound of voices conferring in the background, before Chun continued. "We're going to abandon ship in the next few minutes. Our vessel is beyond saving, but our people are alive because of you. If there's ever anything the Human Colonial Alliance can do to repay this debt, you have only to ask." HFY stared at the communication panel for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. In all his centuries of military service, he had never encountered an enemy who thanked him for defeating them, or an inferior species that offered to repay debts they had no hope of honoring. "Signal the fleet," he said finally. "Prepare to receive survivors. All of them." "Sir, that's nearly 2,000 humans," as HFY Mole pointed out. "Our life support systems aren't configured for their environmental needs. It will be uncomfortable." "Then make adjustments," HFY replied firmly. "These beings just demonstrated more tactical courage than most of our own junior officers. The least we can do is ensure their survival." As the evacuation proceeded, HFY found himself watching the human survivors with growing fascination. They moved with purpose despite their defeat, helping the wounded, organizing supplies, maintaining discipline even as their ships died around them. There was no panic, no despair, just a quiet determination to preserve life wherever possible. One figure stood out among the rest, a tall woman with graying hair and steady eyes who had to be Captain Chun. She was one of the last to leave her ship, personally ensuring that every crew member and piece of critical equipment had been safely transferred. When she finally stepped aboard the Eternal Dominance, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had done their duty regardless of the cost. HFY met her in the docking bay, curious to study this human who had been willing to die for people she barely knew. Up close, she was smaller than he had expected, fragile in the way all humans appeared to more robust species. But her eyes held a quality he recognized from veteran warriors, the calm acceptance of someone who had looked death in the face and found it wanting. "Captain Chun," he said, inclining his head in the formal greeting of one military commander to another. "Iam Commander HFY. Welcome aboard my vessel." She returned the gesture with surprising grace. Commander, I can't begin to express our gratitude. You saved 15,000 lives today, including my crew. That's a debt the Human Colonial Alliance won't forget. You speak of debt, HFY observed, but from my perspective, you demonstrated remarkable tactical discipline under impossible circumstances. Your formation held when most crews would have fled. Your weapon's fire was precise enough to disable rather than destroy. And your final gambit, while ultimately unsuccessful, showed considerable strategic thinking. Chen's eyebrows rose slightly. You sound surprised. I am, he admitted. Human military doctrine has a reputation for being chaotic, emotional. Yet your people fought with discipline that would credit any Vorthack formation. A small smile played at the corners of Chen's mouth. Commander, you've been listening to the wrong stories about humanity. We may be emotional, but we're not stupid. When 15,000 lives are at stake, you don't have the luxury of panic. Over the following days, as the human survivors were transported to safe harbor, HFY found himself engaging in numerous conversations with his unexpected passengers. What he discovered challenged many of his preconceptions about their species. These humans were indeed emotional, quick to laugh or argue or sing together during their evening gatherings. But beneath that surface chaos lay a sophisticated understanding of tactics, logistics, and, most surprisingly, sacrifice. They spoke casually of concepts that most species only theorized about: fighting against impossible odds, choosing death over dishonor, protecting the weak even at the cost of military advantage. For humans, these weren't abstract philosophical concepts, but practical realities they faced on a regular basis. You must understand, Captain Chen explained during one of their discussions, humans have been fighting losing battles for our entire history. We're not the strongest, fastest, or smartest species in any environment. What we learned early was that sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose, no matter what it costs. But surely there are limits, HFY argued. Situations where tactical withdrawal is the only rational choice. Of course, she agreed. But we've also learned that some things are worth dying for. Our families, our freedom, our future. When those are threatened, running away isn't an option. As the days passed and the human survivors settled into temporary quarters aboard his fleet, HFY began to notice other things about their behavior. They adapted quickly to new environments, finding ways to make themselves useful even in situations completely outside their experience. They formed alliances across cultural lines, sharing resources and information with a generosity that seemed almost reckless. And they never stopped asking questions, learning, growing, preparing for whatever challenge might come next. It was this last quality that would prove prophetic because, unknown to any of them, something ancient and terrible was stirring in the dark spaces between galaxies. Something that would test every species' understanding of power, courage, and what it truly meant to fight for survival. But that revelation still lay in the future. For now, HFY was content to revise his understanding of humanity, one conversation at a time, never suspecting that these supposedly weak creatures would soon teach him the most important lesson of his long military career. 3 months after the incident with the human colony fleet, HFY received orders that changed everything. Emergency transmission protocols screamed across his communication systems in the middle of what should have been a routine patrol of the Outer Rim territories. The message bore the highest priority codes of the Galactic Defense Corps, requiring immediate response regardless of current mission status. Standing in the privacy of his command chamber, HFY activated the encrypted hologram projector. The image that materialized before him was that of High Admiral Vextera, Supreme Commander of all Vorthack military forces. Her ancient scales bore the scars of 1,000 battles, and her eyes held the wisdom of someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of entire civilizations. Commander HFY, she began without preamble, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. You are to proceed immediately to coordinates 77 Alpha 99. Long-range scouts have detected something unprecedented approaching from the galactic void. Initial analysis suggests this is not a natural phenomenon. The hologram shifted to display star charts showing the very edge of their galaxy, where the last inhabited systems gave way to the endless dark between stellar formations. A red indicator pulsed at the boundary, marking something that shouldn't exist in the empty space beyond their borders. What are we looking at, Admiral? HFY asked, studying the incomprehensible readings streaming across his displays. We believe it to be a ship, Commander, or perhaps an entire fleet. The energy signatures are unlike anything in our databases, and the scale is... She paused, her composure slipping slightly. The object appears to be approximately the size of a small moon. HFY felt his blood chill. In all the known galaxy, no species had the technology or resources to construct vessels of such magnitude. The largest ships in the Vorthak fleet measured barely 3 kilometers from bow to stern. A moon-sized vessel implied capabilities beyond current understanding. Admiral, with respect, perhaps our sensors are malfunctioning. The readings you're describing are impossible under known physics. Vextara's expression hardened. That's what we thought as well, Commander. Until we received this transmission. The star chart dissolved, replaced by what appeared to be communication static. But as HFY listened more carefully, he began to detect patterns in the chaotic noise. Rhythms. Structures. It was language, but unlike any he had ever encountered. The words seemed to bypass his auditory processing centers and speak directly to some primitive part of his brain, triggering instinctive responses of fear and submission. When the transmission ended, HFY realized he had unconsciously stepped backward from the projector. What was that? A message broadcast on all frequencies approximately 6 hours ago, the Admiral replied. Our linguistic experts have been analyzing it since receipt. The translation is disturbing. Text appeared in the air above the projector, rendered in the formal script of the Vorthak Empire. Lesser children of a dying galaxy, we return to reclaim what was always ours. Your civilizations are temporary occupants of space that belongs to the Devourers. Prepare for consumption. Resistance will only prolong your suffering. HFY read the words twice before their full meaning penetrated. Devourers? Admiral, there are no species by that designation in any historical records. Precisely the problem, Commander. Vextarad gestured, and the hologram shifted to display what appeared to be archaeological data. Ancient stone tablets, crystalline memory cores, fragments of technology so old that their purpose could only be guessed. Our xenoarchaeologists have been working around the clock since the transmission arrived. They've found references to the Devourers in the most ancient records of every major species. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Fragments of epic poems from the crystal archives of Zephyr Prime spoke of hunger from beyond the void. Mechanical data cores from the Nexus Collective's oldest libraries contain corrupted files referencing the consumption of galaxies. Even primitive cave paintings from pre-spaceflight civilizations showed representations of darkness consuming stars. How is this possible? HFY demandet, if such a threat existed, why do we have no clear records? Why is no one prepared for their return? Because, Commander, they apparently consume more than just matter and energy. Every civilization that has encountered the Devourers has had their historical records systematically erased. Only fragments survive, hidden in the most protected archives or disguised as mythology and legend. The implication struck Thexai like a physical blow, an enemy capable of destroying not just civilizations, but the very memory of their existence represented a threat beyond anything the current galactic community had faced. Their advanced weapons, their energy manipulation abilities, their technological superiority meant nothing against a foe that had apparently conquered multiple galaxies across cosmic time. "What are our orders, Admiral?" "You will proceed to the coordinates and establish contact with the advanced fleet already assembling there. Every major species has been notified of the threat. For the first time in recorded history, we are attempting to form a truly unified defense force." Vextara's expression grew grim. "Initial projections suggest we have perhaps 2 months before the Devourer vessel reaches our outer colonies. 2 months to prepare for an enemy we know nothing about," Fexheim mused. "What forces are we assembling?" "Everything, Commander. Vorthack energy manipulation technology, Zephyrian phase shift capabilities, Nexus collective computational power, crystalline resonance weapons, even—" She paused, seeming almost embarrassed. "Even human kinetic armaments." Fexai's eyebrows rose. "Humans. Admiral, their weapons are primitive at best. What possible contribution could they make against a threat of this magnitude?" "That's what I thought as well," Vextara admitted. "But our strategic analysis computers have run every possible scenario using known military capabilities. In 97% of simulations, conventional forces are completely ineffective against the Devourers. The enemy appears to feed on energy itself, making our most advanced weapons useless or even counterproductive. And the remaining 3% require tactics and technologies that fall outside standard military doctrine. Unconventional approaches, desperate measures." The Admiral's voice carried a note of reluctance. "The kind of chaotic, unpredictable strategies that humans are unfortunately famous for." 3 days later, Fexhai arrived at the designated coordinates to find the most extraordinary gathering of military might in galactic history. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species hung in formation around a massive space station that had been constructed specifically for this emergency summit. Vorthack dreadnoughts floated beside crystalline Zephyrian vessels that seemed to exist partially in another dimension. Nexus collective cubes processed information streams, while organic ships from various biological species pulsed with their own forms of life. And scattered throughout the formation, looking tiny and crude beside the technological marvels surrounding them, were human vessels. Their ships appear to be held together with primitive welds and improvised modifications, their hulls scarred from countless battles and repairs. By any objective measure, they were the weakest elements in the assembled fleet. Yet as Thexai watched the maneuver, he noticed something interesting. The human ships moved with a fluid coordination that spoke of extensive practice fighting together. Their formation positions were mathematically precise, allowing them to provide mutual support while maximizing their limited firepower. Most tellingly, they had positioned themselves not at the rear of the formation where logic suggested they belonged, but distributed throughout the fleet in positions that would put them at maximum risk if combat erupted. The strategic briefing took place in the station's central amphitheater, a vast space designed to accommodate the environmental needs of multiple species. Fexhai found himself seated between a Zephyrian phase warrior and a human admiral whose nameplate read Rodriguez. The human was studying data displays with intense concentration, occasionally making notes on a primitive tablet device. High Admiral Vexthera took the central podium, her image projected to ensure visibility for all attendees regardless of their sensory capabilities. Fellow commanders, the situation has deteriorated since our last communication. Long-range sensors indicate the Devourer vessel is accelerating beyond our initial projections. We now estimate first contact in 43 days. Murmurs of dismay rippled through the amphitheater in a dozen different languages. 43 days to prepare for an enemy that had consumed entire galactic clusters was barely enough time to coordinate communications, let alone develop effective countermeasures. However, Vexthera continued, our combined scientific resources have made significant progress in understanding the nature of the threat. Dr. Yelmoth of the Nexus Collective will present our findings. A mechanical form rolled to the podium, its multiple sensors and processing units whirring with activity. When it spoke, its voice was a synthesized approximation of organic speech, efficient but lacking emotional inflection. Analysis of historical fragments suggests the Devourers operate by converting matter and energy into a form of entropic radiation that they use for sustenance and propulsion. This process appears to be maximally effective against high-energy technologies and large-scale organized structures. The implications were immediately clear to every military mind present. Everything that made their civilizations powerful, their energy weapons, their massive ships, their sophisticated computer networks, would actually make them more vulnerable to the Devourer feeding process. Furthermore, Dr. Yelmoth continued, examination of the few surviving records suggests that the Devourers have one significant limitation. Their feeding process requires a certain level of energy density to function efficiently. Low-tech, distributed, and kinetically based systems appear to be less susceptible to immediate consumption. Fexhai found himself glancing at Admiral Rodriguez, who was nodding slowly as if the information confirmed something she had already suspected. When the briefing opened for questions, she was the first to stand. Dr. Yelmoth, you're describing an enemy that becomes stronger when faced with advanced technology. If that's accurate, then our conventional strategy of overwhelming firepower is not just useless, it's actively counterproductive. That assessment appears correct, Admiral Rodriguez. Then we need to think like guerrilla fighters, not like a traditional military force. Hit and run tactics, primitive weapons, distributed command structures that can't be easily targeted or corrupted. Rodriguez looked around the amphitheater, her gaze settling on the various species representatives. We need to fight like humans. A ripple of uncomfortable silence followed her words. The assembled commanders represented the most advanced military thinking in the galaxy. The suggestion that they should abandon their technological advantages and fight like primitives was both insulting and terrifying. But as Fexhai considered the tactical implications, he found himself reluctantly agreeing with the human assessment. If energy-based weapons and sophisticated technology were liabilities rather than assets, then the path to victory lay through methods that every species in the galaxy had long since discarded as obsolete. Admiral Rodriguez, he said, standing to address the assembly, you're suggesting we deliberately handicap our forces by discarding our greatest advantages. How do you propose we inflict meaningful damage on an enemy of this scale using primitive kinetic weapons? Rodriguez smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the coordinates, Fexhai saw something in her expression that reminded him of Captain Chun. Confidence born of experience with impossible odds. Commander Fexhai, humans have been fighting enemies bigger, stronger, and more advanced than ourselves for our entire history. We've learned that the key isn't matching your enemy's strength. It's finding weaknesses they don't expect and exploiting them faster than they can adapt. She activated her primitive data tablet, and somehow the information appeared on the amphitheater's main displays. Tactical diagrams, logistics projections, and strategic assessments scrolled past in dizzying succession. The Devourers are used to fighting advanced civilizations that rely on centralized command structures and standardized technologies. They've developed feeding strategies optimized for those targets. But what happens when they encounter an enemy that operates like a swarm of independent agents, each using different tactics and equipment? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the amphitheater, representatives from various species began accessing their own analytical systems, running projections based on Rodriguez's suggestions. HFY found himself intrigued despite his skepticism. You're proposing asymmetric warfare on a galactic scale. Even if such tactics could be effective, the coordination required would be staggering. How do you maintain strategic coherence across dozens of species with completely different military doctrines? You don't, Rodriguez replied simply. You give each species a different piece of the puzzle and trust them to adapt on the fly. Vorthack forces use energy weapons to create diversions while Zephyrian phase warriors conduct infiltration operations. Nexus collective units process tactical data while human ships deliver kinetic payloads. Everyone does what they do best, but in service of a plan that looks chaotic from the outside. As the briefing continued and the assembled commanders began to grasp the scope of Rodriguez's proposal, HFY realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. Not just the formation of an alliance between species, but the fundamental reimagining of how advanced civilizations approached warfare. The humans, with their crude ships and primitive weapons, were about to teach the galaxy's greatest military mind how to fight like underdogs. And given what they were facing, that might be their only hope of survival. The War Council that followed Admiral Rodriguez's presentation was unlike anything in galactic diplomatic history. Representatives from species that had barely maintained peaceful relations were now attempting to coordinate military strategies that went against every principle of modern warfare. The crystalline amphitheater hummed with translation algorithms working overtime as dozens of languages struggled to convey concepts that had no equivalent in civilized military doctrine. HFY found himself assigned to a mixed-species tactical planning committee, working alongside Admiral Rodriguez and representatives from 3 other major powers. The Zephyrian phase commander, Silthera, existed partially in normal space and partially in quantum dimensions, making direct communication challenging. The Nexus Collective's tactical unit designated itself as Node 7745 and communicated through rapid data transfers that had to be slowed down significantly for organic comprehension. Rounding out the group was Empress Velcara of the Crystalline Hegemony, a being whose thoughts moved at geological timescales, but whose strategic insights spanned centuries of experience. The fundamental problem, Rodriguez was saying, gesturing at holographic displays showing the approaching Devourer vessel, is that we're thinking too much like ourselves and not enough like them. Explain, HFY rumbled, his translation implants struggling slightly with human colloquialisms. Every military doctrine in this galaxy is based on the assumption that your enemy thinks like you do. Same basic needs, same logical processes, same understanding of victory and defeat. Rodriguez pulled up archived footage from humanity's own conflicts, primitive planetary wars fought with crude kinetic weapons. But What if the Devourers operate on completely different assumptions? She highlighted sections of the approaching vessel, pointing out structures that defied conventional understanding of spacecraft design. Look at this thing. It's not built like a ship. It's not even built like a space station. Those formations on the surface look more like feeding structures. Node 7745 interjected, its mechanical voice carrying an undertone of computational certainty. Analysis of surface formations suggests biological analogies. Digestive processes. This entity may not distinguish between military and civilian targets because it does not recognize such categories. Empress Velcara's crystalline form chimed with harmonics that conveyed deep concern. Her thoughts took several minutes to form into words that other species could understand, but when they came, they carried the weight of eons. In the deep archives of our people, there are songs of the time before light. They speak of hunters that consume not just matter and energy, but the very concept of existence. Perhaps these devourers are not military forces as we understand them, but something closer to a natural disaster that happens to be intelligent. The implications were staggering. Military strategies assumed rational opponents with understandable goals. Natural disasters simply destroyed everything in their path without regard for resistance or negotiation. If the Devourers combined the destructive power of a cosmic catastrophe with intelligent adaptation to countermeasures, conventional warfare became not just ineffective but literally meaningless. So how do you fight a force of nature? Thexai asked. Rodriguez grinned, and once again Thexai was reminded of Captain Chin's expression when facing impossible odds. You don't fight it. You survive it. And while you're surviving, you look for ways to turn its own power against itself. Over the following weeks, as the Devourer vessel continued its inexorable approach, the combined fleet began implementing strategies that would have been considered insane under normal circumstances. Vorthack engineers worked alongside human technicians to deliberately degrade their energy weapons, reducing power output to levels that wouldn't trigger optimal feeding responses. Zephyrian phase warriors trained with human special forces operators, learning tactics designed for fighting in environments where technological superiority was irrelevant. Nexus collective computational nodes were programmed to operate in isolation, their vast processing networks deliberately fragmented to avoid presenting large-scale targets. Thexai spent his days moving between different sections of the joint operation, observing preparations that challenged every military principle he had learned in 3 centuries of service. In the Vorthack engineering sections, his own people were systematically damaging their weapons to make them less effective. In the human quarters, primitive projectile weapons were being manufactured using techniques that predated spaceflight. Most disturbing of all, in the command centers, carefully structured chains of authority were being replaced with loose networks of independent operators who could continue fighting even if all centralized leadership was destroyed. It was during one of these inspection tours that he encountered Captain Chin again. The human officer had volunteered to serve as a liaison between the various species' special forces units, helping to coordinate training exercises that prepared elite warriors for combat with their hands tied behind their backs. Commander Thexai. She greeted him as he entered the training facility where Vorthack shock troops were learning to fight without energy shields. I want to thank you again for saving my people. Without that experience, I might not have understood what Admiral Rodriguez was proposing. Captain, I've been meaning to ask you about that day. Your crew's willingness to sacrifice themselves for civilians was educational. But what I still don't understand is why you thank me for defeating you. Chun paused in her review of training schedules, considering the question carefully. Because you didn't defeat us, Commander. You saved us. There's a difference. Is there? Your mission failed. Your ship was destroyed. By any military measure, you suffered total defeat. Our mission was to protect 15,000 civilians and get them safely to their new colony. Chen's voice carried the quiet certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. Those people are alive and safe because you intervened. That makes our mission a complete success, regardless of what happened to our ships. Fek's eyes stared at her for a long moment, processing this perspective that seemed to turn standard military thinking inside out. You consider the loss of your vessel acceptable because your primary objective was achieved. I consider the loss of our vessel irrelevant because our primary objective was achieved. The distinction was subtle but important. Commander, humans learned a long time ago that winning battles isn't the same as accomplishing your mission. Sometimes you have to lose everything else to save what really matters. As the days shortened toward first contact with the Devourers, Fek's found himself returning to that conversation repeatedly. Around him, the greatest military minds in the galaxy were preparing to lose battles in hopes of accomplishing their mission. Ships were being rigged as disposable weapons. Elite soldiers were training to fight with primitive equipment. Command structures were being designed to fail gracefully rather than maintain perfect coordination. It was, by every traditional measure, a recipe for disaster. Yet, as Fek's observed the joint exercises and strategic preparations, he began to notice something unexpected. The various species, forced to abandon their technological advantages and work with unfamiliar tactics, were developing new forms of cooperation. Vorthack soldiers who had never trusted non-Vorthack allies were learning to coordinate with human marines who thought like predators rather than warriors. Zephyrian Fae scouts were sharing intelligence with crystalline resonance warriors who processed information on completely different timescales. The fleet that was taking shape bore no resemblance to any military force in galactic history. It was chaotic, redundant, and deliberately inefficient. It was also, Fek's began to suspect, exactly what they needed to face an enemy that consumed order and efficiency for sustenance. 2 weeks before estimated first contact, Rodriguez called a final strategic briefing. The assembled commanders now numbered in the thousands, representing not just the major species, but dozens of smaller civilizations that had never before participated in galactic politics. The amphitheater had been expanded multiple times to accommodate the unprecedented gathering. Ladies, gentlemen, beings, and collective consciousnesses, Rodriguez began, her voice carried by translation systems to every attendee regardless of their sensory modalities. In 14 days, we're going to face an enemy that has consumed entire galactic clusters. Our conventional wisdom says we have no hope of victory. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the vast space. Everyone present understood the scale of the threat they faced. Our conventional wisdom is correct, Rodriguez continued, causing the murmurs to shift toward confusion. We cannot defeat the Devourers through superior force or advanced technology. We cannot outrun them or hide from them. By every rational measure, our civilizations are doomed. The amphitheater fell silent as thousands of military minds processed this blunt assessment. Fortunately, Rodriguez said with a smile that somehow managed to be reassuring despite the circumstances, humans gave up on rational measures a long time ago. We're going to do something that no species in their galactic consumption spree has ever attempted. We're going to fight them on terms they've never encountered before. She activated the main display, showing a tactical overview that looked like organized chaos. Hundreds of small units operating independently, striking at different targets with completely different strategies, coordinating through loose networks that could survive massive disruption. The Devourers expect to face fleets. Instead, they'll encounter swarms. They expect centralized command structures. Instead, they'll face thousands of independent decision-makers. They expect advanced weapons designed for maximum efficiency. Instead, they'll encounter primitive technologies optimized for survival rather than destruction. HFY studied the tactical display with growing understanding. It wasn't a battle plan in any traditional sense. It was an ecosystem of military chaos designed to persist and adapt rather than achieve decisive victory. Our objective is not to destroy the Devourer vessel, Rodriguez explained. Our objective is to survive long enough to learn how to hurt them, then hurt them enough to make them leave. We're not trying to win a war. We're trying to make ourselves too expensive to consume. In the days that followed, as the final preparations were completed and the joint fleet moved toward the projected intercept coordinates, HFY found his understanding of warfare fundamentally changed. He had spent centuries thinking of military conflicts as contests between organized forces with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The humans had taught him to think of war as something closer to a natural process, adaptation, survival, and evolution under extreme pressure. The irony was not lost on him that the supposedly weakest species in the galaxy had become the teachers in humanity's greatest educational institution. As he stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominance, watching human ships take their positions throughout the fleet formation, HFY realized that the real battle had already been won, not against the Devourers, but against the assumption that advanced civilizations had nothing to learn from primitive ones. In 3 days, they would discover whether that lesson would be enough to save the galaxy. But, regardless of the outcome, HFY knew that his understanding of true power had been forever changed by the species that fought best when fighting was hopeless. The first sign that the Devourers had arrived was not visual or electromagnetic, but something far more disturbing. Reality itself seemed to shudder as the massive vessel translated from whatever dimension it used for faster-than-light travel into normal space. Every sensor system in the joint fleet registered the arrival simultaneously, not because they detected a ship, but because they detected the absence of everything else. HFY stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominance, watching his displays struggle to process information that violated basic principles of physics. Where there should have been stars in the background, there was simply nothing. Not darkness, but a complete void where space-time itself seemed to have been consumed. The Devourer vessel existed at the center of this expanding bubble of nothingness, feeding on reality as it moved. By the ancient stones, Swytijmol whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of emergency systems activating across the ship. It's not just consuming matter and energy. It's consuming space itself. The tactical displays flickered and died as the expanding void interfered with sensor networks. Emergency backup systems came online, providing minimal information through purely optical sensors and primitive electromagnetic detection. The joint fleet found itself fighting with sensor technology that predated their entry into space, reduced to visual observation and basic radio communication. Admiral Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system, the signal degraded by interference from whatever the Devourer vessel was doing to local space-time. All units, this is Fleet Command. Implement Protocol Chaos immediately. Repeat, Protocol Chaos is now in effect. Protocol Chaos was humanity's contribution to Joint Fleet Doctrine, a command structure designed to function when normal coordination became impossible. Instead of receiving detailed orders from centralized command, Each unit was given broad objectives and told to pursue them using whatever method seemed appropriate. It was military anarchy, but anarchy with purpose. HFY activated his ship's emergency command protocols, switching from the sophisticated fleet coordination systems they had trained with to primitive point-to-point communication methods. Around him, the rest of the joint fleet was doing the same, transforming from a coordinated military formation into what appeared to be hundreds of independent vessels operating on their own initiative. Commander, Kelvio reported from the communication station. We're receiving transmission fragments from forward scout units. Visual contact has been established with the target. Put it through. The main display activated, showing a transmission from a human reconnaissance vessel that had managed to approach within visual range of the Devourer's ship. What HFY saw defied every assumption he had made about their enemy. The vessel was indeed the size of a small moon, but it bore no resemblance to any spacecraft in galactic databases. Its surface was covered with what appeared to be organic structures, massive tendrils that writhed in the vacuum of space, opening and closing like flower petals or feeding mouths. The entire construct pulsed with a rhythm that suggested biological processes operating on a planetary scale. But most disturbing were the smaller objects orbiting the central mass. Ships, or what had once been ships from dozens of different species and technological traditions. Some were clearly ancient, their designs predating current galactic civilization by millennia. Others were recognizably modern, including several that matched current Vorthack engineering standards. "Those are our ships," Swythmol said unnecessarily. "Ships from the outer colonies that disappeared over the past few months." The captured vessels moved in perfect formation around their captor, their hulls modified with the same organic-looking structures that covered the main body. They had been converted, transformed from independent vessels into extensions of the Devourer's feeding apparatus. "Fleet command to all units." Rodriguez's voice cut through their horrified observation. "Target identification confirmed. We are facing a collective intelligence that converts defeated forces into extensions of itself. Standard capture protocols are not applicable. Implement termination procedures for any vessel that exhibits conversion symptoms." The order was unprecedented in galactic military history. Rodriguez was authorizing Allied forces to destroy their own ships rather than allow them to be captured and turned against the fleet. It was the kind of desperate measure that civilized species discussed in theoretical contexts, but never actually implemented. HFY found himself thinking of Captain Chen's words about losing everything else to save what really mattered. The humans had somehow anticipated even this horror, preparing their allies for decisions that went against every instinct of military honor. "All stations prepare for combat," he ordered. "Weapons systems to minimum power. Implement human-style harassment protocols." The next few hours dissolved into the strangest battle in galactic history. Instead of the massive energy exchanges that characterized modern space combat, the joint fleet engaged in hidden, run attacks using weapons that would have been considered obsolete centuries ago. Kinetic projectiles, primitive missiles, even directed debris fields launched at relativistic speeds. The Devourer vessel responded to each attack by extending feeding tendrils toward the attacking ships, attempting to drain their energy and convert them to extensions of itself. But the deliberately weakened weapons and distributed attack patterns meant that no single ship presented enough energy density to trigger optimal feeding responses. Human vessels darted through the combat zone like ancient fighter aircraft, launching salvos of kinetic rounds before disappearing into the debris field that surrounded the battle. Vorthack ships used their energy weapons at minimum power settings, creating diversions rather than attempting to inflict damage. Zephyrian phase warriors materialized inside the enemy vessel's hull, planting primitive explosive devices before vanishing back into quantum dimensions. HFY watched his tactical displays struggle to track the chaotic engagement, realizing that for the first time in his military career, he had no clear picture of the battle's progress. Information flowed through the fleet in fragments, rumors, and contradictory reports. Individual ship commanders made tactical decisions based on incomplete data and pure instinct. It should have been a recipe for complete disaster. Instead, it appeared to be working. The Devourer vessel, designed to consume organized military formations, struggled to adapt to an enemy that had no central nervous system to attack. Each time it extended feeding tendrils toward one group of ships, another group would attack from a different angle. When it attempted to drain energy from Vorthack vessels, human ships would ram kinetic projectiles into the feeding structures. When it tried to phase lock onto Zephyrian attackers, crystalline resonance warriors would disrupt its targeting systems. But the cost was terrible. Every few minutes, another Allied vessel would disappear from the communication network, either destroyed outright or captured and converted. The joint fleet was slowly bleeding away, one ship at a time, in exchange for minor damage to structures that the enemy could apparently regenerate. "Commander," Swighthmol reported, his voice tight with stress, "we're receiving emergency transmission from the human command vessel. Admiral Rodriguez is requesting immediate tactical consultation. Put her through." The communication link was barely functional, degraded by interference and battle damage. Rodriguez's image flickered on the display, her face streaked with what appeared to be blood, her uniform torn and scorched. "Commander HFY, we need to implement terminal protocol." HFY felt his blood chill. Terminal protocol was the absolute last resort in human military doctrine, reserved for situations where mission success required the complete destruction of your own forces. It was the strategic equivalent of Captain Chen's ramming attack, scaled up to fleet level. "Admiral, surely we haven't reached that point yet. Our forces are still inflicting damage, and the enemy appears to be struggling with our unconventional tactics." "Sir, you're not seeing the full picture." Rodriguez gestured off-screen, and the transmission shifted to show tactical data streaming from multiple sources. The Devourer isn't struggling to adapt. It's learning. Each attack teaches it more about our capabilities. At current rates of adaptation, it will have effective countermeasures for all our tactics within 6 hours. The data was undeniable. The enemy's response time to attacks was decreasing with each engagement. Its feeding tendrils were beginning to target the specific energy signatures of different species technologies. Worst of all, the converted ships were starting to operate in coordination, using their original species' tactical knowledge to anticipate Allied movements. "What does terminal protocol involve?" HFY asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Every ship in the fleet converges on the target simultaneously, using maximum power output to trigger optimal feeding responses. The enemy will attempt to consume our entire fleet at once, which should overload its feeding apparatus and create a cascade failure. And our survival rate?" Rodriguez's expression provided the answer before her words did. "Effectively 0, Commander. But the cascade failure should damage the Devourer enough to force it to withdraw from our galaxy while it regenerates." HFY stared at the transmission for a long moment, processing the implications. Rodriguez was proposing that every Allied vessel commit suicide in the hope of inflicting enough damage to save their respective civilizations. It was the ultimate expression of human tactical philosophy, losing everything to save what mattered most. "Admiral, there has to be another way." Some alternative that doesn't require the complete sacrifice of our forces. Sir, with respect, this is exactly what we trained for. Every species in this fleet volunteered, knowing that survival was unlikely. The question isn't whether we're willing to die for our people. The question is whether we're willing to make that sacrifice count for something. Around the bridge of the Eternal Dominance, Fexhi's crew listened to the exchange with expressions ranging from horror to grim determination. These were Vorthak warriors who had served with him for decades, beings who had followed him through countless battles across the galaxy. The thought of ordering them to their deaths for a tactic that might not even work was almost unbearable. But as he watched the tactical displays showing the Devourers' continuing adaptation to their strategies, Fexhi realized that Rodriguez was right. They were fighting a learning enemy with finite surprises. Eventually, their unconventional tactics would become predictable, and their distributed command structure would become irrelevant. The only advantage they still possessed was the enemy's inability to predict complete irrationality. "All stations," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the bridge with final authority. "Prepare to implement terminal protocol. Signal the fleet. We're going to give these Devourers a lesson in what happens when you threaten the wrong galaxy." As emergency klaxons wailed, and his crew began the final preparations for their ultimate mission, Fexhi found himself thinking one last time about Captain Shun and her willingness to sacrifice her ship for people she barely knew. He finally understood what she had been trying to tell him about the difference between defeat and failure. In 30 minutes, the greatest fleet in galactic history would cease to exist. But if Rodriguez was right, their destruction would echo across space, and time is a warning to any force that thought consuming civilizations was safe or easy. The weak had become teachers. Now it was time for the final lesson. The countdown to terminal protocol felt both endless and impossibly brief. 20 minutes to coordinate the final attack of thousands of ships from dozens of species, each operating on different tactical doctrines and communication systems. 20 minutes to say goodbye to crews who had followed their commanders across the galaxy, trusting in decisions that had led them to this moment of ultimate sacrifice. Fexhi moved through the corridors of the Eternal Dominance, visiting each station to speak personally with crew members who had served under him for decades. In the engine compartments, Vorthak engineers worked with grim efficiency to remove the safety protocols that prevented their power cores from catastrophic overload. In the weapons bays, gunners prepared to channel every erg of energy their systems could generate into a single, overwhelming salvo. Throughout the ship, beings who had spent their lives mastering the art of staying alive were preparing to die with purpose. "Commander," Swite E.H. Mole approached him in the main corridor, his expression carrying the weight of their shared history. "The crew wants you to know that they consider it an honor to serve under your command in this final battle." Fexhi gripped his tactical officer's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than words could express. "The honor has been mine, old friend. You made every decision easier by ensuring I never had to doubt the competence of my people." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the joint fleet. On human vessels, crew members recorded final messages for families they would never see again. Zephyrian phase warriors prepared for translation into quantum dimensions, hoping their consciousness might survive even if their ships did not. Crystalline beings harmonized in resonant frequencies that would be their species' final song of war. Rodriguez's voice cut through the fleet communication network, somehow managing to reach every vessel despite the interference generated by the Devourer's presence. "All units, this is Fleet Command. Terminal protocol will commence in 15 minutes. I want every being in this fleet to know that your sacrifice today will be remembered by generations who will live free because of your courage. On the tactical displays, the enemy continued its relentless adaptation. Converted ships now moved in formations that mimicked the Joint Fleet's own tactics, using captured knowledge to anticipate and counter Allied maneuvers. The Devourer vessel itself had begun extending specialized feeding tendrils designed to target specific species' energy signatures. Time was running out faster than their countdown indicated. 10 minutes to terminal protocol, Rodriguez announced. All ships begin final approach vectors. Power cores to maximum output. Weapons systems to full charge. HFY felt the deck vibrate beneath his feet as the Eternal Dominance's engines reached levels that would normally trigger emergency shutdown procedures. Around him, the ship's systems strained against operational limits that had been designed to ensure long-term survival rather than maximum performance. Warning lights flashed throughout the corridors as automated systems screamed protests about conditions that exceeded all safety parameters. Through the main display, he watched hundreds of Allied vessels accelerate toward the Devourer ship in what appeared to be a massive suicide charge. Human destroyers, their hulls glowing with heat from overloaded engines, raced alongside Vorthack dreadnoughts that sparked with barely contained energy. Zephyrian vessels flickered in and out of phase as their pilots pushed quantum drives beyond safe limits. The entire combined fleet had become a weapon aimed at the heart of an enemy that fed on the destruction of civilizations. 5 minutes to terminal protocol. Rodriguez's voice carried a note of fierce pride. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, know that you are making history. The Devourers have consumed entire galactic clusters, but they have never faced beings willing to pay any price for freedom. The enemy's response was immediate and devastating. The Devourer vessel extended feeding tendrils toward the approaching fleet while simultaneously launching waves of converted ships to intercept. Space filled with energy beams and kinetic projectiles as the final battle of the Galactic War erupted across a volume of space that dwarfed most solar systems. But something was wrong with the enemy's countermeasures. The Devourer's feeding tendrils, designed to drain energy from ships attempting to flee or fight defensively, were overwhelmed by vessels deliberately channeling maximum power output. Instead of the controlled consumption that characterized the entity's normal feeding process, it was being forced to accept massive energy influxes that strained its absorption capabilities. 2 minutes to terminal protocol, Rodriguez announced, her voice now carrying an undertone of surprised hope. All units, maintain maximum power output. The enemy appears to be experiencing cascade resonance failures. HFY watched his displays in fascination as the theoretical predictions of the Joint Fleet scientists began manifesting in reality. The Devourer vessel evolved to consume the carefully regulated energy output of advanced civilizations, was choking on the deliberate excess being fed to it by ships operating beyond their design limits. Its surface began to pulse with irregular rhythms as feeding structures struggled to process more energy than they could safely absorb. 1 minute to terminal protocol. All units, prepare for final convergence. The countdown reached zero as thousands of ships from dozens of species reached optimal range of the Devourer vessel and simultaneously released every weapon in their arsenals. Energy beams that could sterilize planets lanced through space alongside kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. The combined firepower of the greatest military alliance in galactic history focused on a single target with the concentrated fury of species fighting for their right to exist. The result exceeded every prediction and simulation that had been run in preparation for this moment. The Devourer vessel, forced to absorb energy output equivalent to the total power generation of several star systems, experienced catastrophic failure across its entire feeding network. The organic structures covering its surface convulsed and began to tear themselves apart as internal pressure exceeded structural limits. The converted ships orbiting the main body suddenly went dark, their controlling intelligence overwhelmed by the cascade failure propagating through the entity's nervous system. But the cost of victory was exactly what Rodriguez had predicted. Every ship in the joint fleet, operating beyond safe limits and channeling maximum power output, began to suffer critical system failures. Vorthack vessels exploded as their energy cores overloaded. Human ships came apart as their hulls, heated beyond material tolerance, simply vaporized. Crystalline craft shattered into component molecules as harmonic resonance tore apart their molecular bonds. HFY felt the deck plating beneath his feet begin to buckle as the eternal dominance entered its final moments. Emergency lighting failed throughout the ship as power systems exceeded their design tolerances and began to melt. Around him, his crew maintained their positions with the discipline of professional soldiers, continuing to channel every available erg of energy toward their target, even as their ship disintegrated around them. "It's working," as Dwight H. reported, his voice barely audible over the sound of failing systems. "The enemy vessel is breaking apart. Sir, we actually did it." Through the main display, now flickering and distorted by battle damage, HFY watched the impossible sight of the Devourer vessel losing structural integrity. The entity that had consumed entire galactic clusters was tearing itself apart. Its feeding apparatus turned against itself by beings who understood that some victories could only be achieved through total sacrifice. The last thing HFY saw before his ship's systems failed completely was a transmission from Admiral Rodriguez, her image barely recognizable through static and interference. She was still at her post on the bridge of her flagship, somehow managing to coordinate the final moments of the fleet's destruction while her own vessel came apart around her. "All units, mission accomplished," she said, her voice carrying across the fleet frequency with the calm authority of someone who had always known this moment would come. "The target is neutralized. Enemy vessel is experiencing total cascade failure. Galactic defense has been achieved." Then, the transmission cut off as the human command vessel joined the rest of the joint fleet in glorious annihilation. HFY closed his eyes as the eternal dominance shook itself apart, thinking one final time about Captain Shun and her words about the difference between defeat and victory. They had lost every ship, every crew member, every piece of advanced military hardware that represented the pinnacle of galactic civilization. By any conventional measure, they had suffered the most complete defeat in military history. But they had also saved the galaxy. In the weeks that followed, as rescue ships from the inner systems arrived to survey the battlefield, they found a debris field that stretched across several light minutes of space. The remains of the greatest military alliance in galactic history floated alongside the scattered fragments of an entity that had terrorized the cosmos for eons. Long-range sensors confirmed that the Devourer vessel was indeed destroyed, its feeding apparatus permanently disabled, and its controlling intelligence fragmented beyond recovery. Among the debris, they found a single functioning escape pod that had somehow survived the holocaust of the final battle. Inside, barely alive and severely injured, they discovered a human officer who had served as Admiral Rodriguez's aide during the final engagement. Through her testimony, the galaxy learned the full story of humanity's gift to the civilized species of their local cluster. The weak had taught the strong what real power meant. not the ability to dominate through superior technology or overwhelming force, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for something more important than individual survival. The humans had shown them that victory wasn't about being stronger than your enemies. It was about being willing to pay a higher price than they could imagine. The memorial constructed in the neutral zone, where the final battle had taken place, bore inscriptions in every language spoken by the Joint Fleet. But the central message was written in human script, translated into galactic standard for beings who would never again underestimate the species that had given them all a future worth living for. Here lies the combined fleet of the Galactic Defense Alliance. They taught us that the greatest strength is not the power to destroy your enemies, but the courage to save your friends. May their sacrifice remind us all that freedom is not free, and some things are worth any price. Commander HFY never lived to see that memorial, but in the final moments of his existence, he understood the lesson that humanity had spent generations learning. Real power wasn't about the weapons you carried or the abilities you were born with. Real power was about knowing what you were willing to die for and having the courage to make that choice when a moment came. The galaxy was saved by the weakest species it contained, who proved that weakness was just another word for having something so valuable that you would sacrifice everything else to protect it.